Well, good morning and welcome in this morning to this third of four studies on readings from Isaiah for Advent this year. We'll be looking at Isaiah 35, 1 through 10. It's actually the whole chapter, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. But why don't we start with a word of prayer. God, in this busy season of Advent, we give thanks for this time to be quiet and to listen and to discuss and to try to better understand the word that you have for us. As we hear the prophetic words of Isaiah today, in the very words that we'll study, may our eyes be opened and our ears be unstopped, that we might hear and see the message you have for us. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, wanted to start off this morning just with some general notes about Isaiah. I mentioned, I think at our first session, that depending upon your scholarly take on the book, that it's generally agreed that the book of Isaiah is actually made up of three separate books written by three different people at three different times. And they're tied together thematically because they all have to do with the Babylonian exile. And so the opening chapters of Isaiah in what is known as Proto-Isaiah is chapters 1 through 39. And that's really believed to probably be the authentic writing of the 8th century prophet Isaiah. Deutero-Isaiah is, or Second Isaiah as it's sometimes called, is chapters 40 to 55 and takes place during the exile. There are references in those chapters that make it clear that whoever is writing from a position of exile. And so that's separate from the opening words of Isaiah, which are generally warnings and prophecies about what's about to happen. We talked last week about the Assyrians who were coming in to invade and overrun Israel. And that's the concern of the first section. The second section comes from a place of exile. And then what's sometimes known as Third Isaiah is chapters 56 to 66. And there's a lot of references in that section about returning or having returned from exile. And so we know historically that spans a significant period of time. There would not be a single author. In addition, we've talked before, we talked about translation last week, but we've talked before about the way that scholars can sort of identify and group things together based on linguistic style or certain vocabulary that's used in the writings, and can tend to group those with a specific author or a specific time period. And so that's essentially that's how the determination's been made, that this is probably a combination of several different authors kind of writing about the same event. So that's one way of approaching it. All of the readings we're studying in this study come from the first section of Isaiah before chapter 39. So characteristically, the stuff we're reading is prophetic writings about the ultimate redemption that God will provide. And I think we talked about it a little bit last week or the week before, that a lot of this, the context in which a lot of these passages we're studying is written is, okay, we're in a place of no hope because here come the Assyrians and we've seen what they've done to everybody else and they're about to do it to us. Why have you forsaken us, God? That sort of position. And so Isaiah says, all right, get your act together, get right with God, it's gonna be okay, because there's gonna be this period of hardship, but the ultimate end is, and then we get passages like the one that we're gonna look at today. So all the stuff we're reading tends to come from that first section. Now there's another way of looking at the book of Isaiah, and that is to split it pretty much in half. Isaiah is 66 chapters long, and if you take chapters 1 through 33 and look at them as a unit, it's kind of an extension of what I was just mentioning. It's a lot of warnings of judgment and promises of subsequent restoration for Jerusalem and the world. And then the second half then, chapters 34 to 66, could be lumped together with the idea that the judgment has already taken place and restoration is at hand. So, broader scale, we're obviously not looking in this study at the entirety of the book of Isaiah, but it's helpful to know and understand what the context is as we come to it.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll see a little bit of that actually in our reading today about basically these proposed divisions of Isaiah are essentially, they're all theories because nobody knows for certain who wrote what, when, and why. Like I said, the division of three is often based on sort of linguistic and literary analysis. The second division is just organized by the content. And so we'll come back to that in a minute, but I just invite you to remember that because we're looking at chapter 35. So if you look at the three-way split of Isaiah, it falls squarely in the first section because we're looking at chapters 1 through 39. If you divide it by 2, it falls in the second section because the division would take place between chapters 33 and 34. So just something to keep in the back of your mind as we move forward. So I've provided the parallels again. If you're watching this at home, I'll attach a copy of this or a link to it rather under the video so that you can look at it too. But a little longer section, so the last parallel is on the back of the sheet. And what I wanted to bring today was I brought my copy of the Tanakh, and I'll pass it around if you're interested in looking at it. What do we know about the Hebrew language? Not a lot.
You start from the back to front.
You start from the back and go to the front, and you read from right to left.
Yes.
So,
No vowels in it.
No vowels.
no vowels. Well, you
Well,
won't be
no
able to
vowels
tell that from
in the
here.
writing as well.
That's right. So the first thing you'll notice is the cover of the book
Is at the back.
is on the back.
Yeah.
And if you open the back cover, you get the presentation page for, and then as you move forward, you get a title page, and then you get the introductory material. So when you look at this, so Genesis is all the way back here in the back, and then you move through the rest of what we would call the Old Testament. This is a parallel, so on each page there's the English translation and the Hebrew
Right.
is on the right. So anyway, I will pass it around. It's just interesting to look at. And something
What
that,
version do they use for the English?
well, so that is the,
Is
it's
the
this
one
version here,
The
yeah.
one that we have here?
Mhm.
I get
And maybe, that book is older than 2023, so it may be slightly different, but it's
Just
JPS,
Jewish Publications.
Publication, yeah. Yeah.
Ah.
yeah. So it's their translation, and, yeah, so there may be, I didn't look up this passage in there to see, but there may be a little variation, but it'll be pretty close to what you have on the paper in front of you. Okay, so I know for the last couple of weeks we've been real heavy on the word study kind of approach to looking at these passages, and so what I want to do today is a little bit different. I want to start off and just make a couple of, share a couple of notes about specific points in the text. But then I want to take some time and think about sort of the larger interpretation issues and ideas that come from this text, because ultimately that is why, well, it's why we're studying them, because they've been identified and are often used in context with Advent, and we hear them in association with Advent. And so, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about why that is and how it relates to our celebration and understanding of Advent and Christmas and all that kind of goes along with that. But a couple of things first, just with the text. So in Isaiah, actually in a lot of prophetic writing, but especially in Isaiah, you'll often get imagery like we see in the first verse or so of this passage. It talks about the barren desert, the wilderness, again, depending on translation and so forth, the dry land, those sorts of images of wasteland and barrenness and chaotic wildness really speak towards the idea of what does it feel like to be in exile. So if we try to put ourselves in the position of Isaiah's community, either threatened with the likelihood of going into exile or the lived reality of being in exile, what does that experience feel like? And how would you, as someone in exile, try to explain how that feels, right? Can you think of any other times in the Bible where there are descriptions of sort of the emotions and the feelings of being in that place of exile?
Oh, Moses took the people out of Egypt, didn't he?
Yeah. Well,
They weren't always very happy, were they?
No, but they spent the time where? In the wilderness, right? Yeah, lost, and that whole narrative about the Israelites in the wilderness, we can see over and over how easy it was for them to get lost and distracted to things, how much trouble they got themselves into out in the middle of nowhere, and how that affected sort of their relation with God. Yeah. What else?
Is that Jesus in the wilderness?
Jesus in the wilderness. Yeah, that's
He
interesting.
was tempted, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly moving to that place of chaos and uncertainty, and he's fasting, and so there's all this sort of restriction and depriving of oneself. Yeah.
You get people longing to be somewhere where the desert isn't. I mean, you get by the rivers of Babylon.
Yes.
They're dreaming of things like that.
Yes.
Because they are somewhere else, and
Yeah.
they just want, an oasis and water and life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ezekiel's vision,
Yes.
it all takes place in the desert, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I don't think there's anything but desert in Ezekiel, is it?
there's a lot of desert. I mean, And so, it certainly is this metaphor that appears over and over in these different prophets. Well, and I was thinking, I don't know if it was where you were going, Brenda, with your comment, but, you know, in Psalm 137, how do we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? You know, I think that's a powerful sort of realistic expression of this kind of symbolic idea. So we kind of keep that in mind, that's, you know, you read chapter 35 in Isaiah, and the imagery is beautiful, powerful, but it's also, you know, we need to think about why the imagery is what it is, and what message that might share. In verse 7, so if you look at the different translations, and I didn't look at, you'll see, for example, in the Tanakh translation, it talks about torrid earth and parched land. The NRSV talks about burning sand and thirsty ground. So you see a bunch of, it's obvious they're trying to sort of convey the same idea, but come up with very different ways of doing so. And that's because the word in verse 7, sharav, thing, is a Hebrew word that doesn't have a direct cognate in English. So Alter talks about that it means something like heat scorch, which again wouldn't be a word that we would probably have a ready synonym for, but that just image of scorching the earth or the air.
We talk about parched earth, don't we?
Yeah. So this is probably parched earth, and maybe even something a little beyond that.
It's just one word.
Yeah, yes, yeah. So, so it's just interesting to again look at how different approaches see it in different ways. Verse 8 talks about a highway. And so the imagery of that would be, well, what do you think? What is the highway, and what is the destination of that highway? In the context of this song, of this
They want to
passage.
get to Jerusalem, which is the holy city.
Yeah. So it's again, so that is that promised return from exile.
Is it like there's some, there's some of the Psalms are specifically written for when you approach Israel, approach Jerusalem.
Approach Jerusalem.
For the Passover or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, it could be connected to that. I'd have to.
They
to look and see.
They use the same sort of, it's always going to be the goal, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
There's no songs about going home from
Going up for Christmas.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So this is, I told you there's a little bit of debate about where exactly this passage fits in those larger constructs of the book of Isaiah that we talked about a few minutes ago. And so is the highway that's talked about here, is that part of a prophecy, or is it part of this position of being in exile and dreaming of this way to return home? Now, in the whole scheme of things, that's kind of a minor point. But if we go down to verse 10, verse 10, at least in Hebrew, is an exact duplicate of Isaiah 51:11, which is on page 715. And I should have done this before doing this live, but I didn't check to see if this actually lines up. In the Good News translation, verse 10 says, "They will reach Jerusalem with gladness, singing and shouting for joy. They will be happy forever, forever free from sorrow and grief." And 51:11,
Exactly the same.
yeah, "Those who you have rescued will reach Jerusalem with gladness, singing and shouting for joy. They'll be happy forever and forever be free from sorrow and grief." So, obviously, we don't know what exactly is the connection. Was that written by the same person? Was it a refrain from a hymn or a song or a prayer that would have been offered in worship? But stands out that it's an exact copy of that. So, scholars would ask, well, okay, does that mean that this section of Isaiah belongs with a later author? Or does it belong with the original? So for our purposes here, it honestly doesn't really matter. We're not doing a scholarly critique of the entire thing of Isaiah. But what I want to offer today is, and Isaiah is not alone. You see this with a lot of, especially the really old texts in the Old Testament, is that occasionally there will be a section that kind of appears in the middle of a book that obviously doesn't belong with everything around it. And I'm trying to think of a good example. I know we've talked about them before. I think there's a couple in Job that kind of, I think the Job song in the whale.
Yes, because you get a narrative and then you get this bit, chapter
Yes.
35, which is like a song in the middle of everything else,
Yes,
isn't it?
yes.
I mean, we've got story, and you've got that, but
Yeah.
and you go back to the story
Yes.
again.
Yes, and so so when you see something like that, then, you know, it's reason to pause and think about, why is that? You know, if someone added it in later, why did they add it in? You know, if you look at the end of the Gospel of Mark, for example, there's like 3 different endings to it. Why? Why was it important to someone or some group of people to rewrite the ending and clean it up or change parts of it? And so one of the terms for this sort of injection of a text from somewhere else is that it's a word out of place. And so I was really thinking about that term this week and thinking about a word out of place. So here, maybe this is a literal set of words out of place, that they belong or were originally somewhere else and for one reason or another got shifted around. But in the larger scheme of things, what Isaiah is doing through prophecy is prophecy, not also a word out of place. So whether this is written in anticipation of this invasion and exile and all the misery and horribleness that's going to happen, or whether it's written from a place of being in exile and dreaming and longing for this redemption that God will bring, are those prophecies not in themselves a word out of place? Is prophecy by definition a word out of place? Does that make sense? So when you hear, well, so I think that helps to make a link between that and sort of what we do in Advent. I would argue that the whole point of Advent is that it's a word out of place. Now, granted, it's anticipating the birth of Jesus, but so much of what we read and think about in those weeks leading up to that are texts like this one, or are other Old Testament prophetic texts. And yes, some of them talk about a Messiah, which we obviously make the link to Jesus with. But there's not really, I mean, this is not a prophecy about the Messiah. This is a prophecy about the ultimate redemption of the world by God. So I think Advent is a time where if we really kind of take it to heart, it should be a word out of place. Now, does that happen literally? If you think about all the associations with the secular Christmas season with light, I mean, think about all the lights up and down the main street, and if you have a Christmas tree at home, you have lights on it, people put lights on their houses. I mean, that's a really central part of how we come to celebrate that. But we do that, what, in the darkest month of the year, for the most part. So is that sort of an expression of hope, a word out of place? It's not light right now, because it's dark this time of year, but I'm gonna put the lights up anyway, provide our own light. Because if you think about, if you were reading this in either in exile or knowing that that's where you were headed really soon, what would you think about hearing these words?
It's words of hope, isn't
Yeah,
it?
that's
Yeah.
They're
But
very-
in that moment, would you think,
It's not
there's
good
no
enough.
way?
Are you sure?
No.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think there'd be that element in everybody, wouldn't I think?
yeah.
The first part of John's Gospel, it talks about the light.
Yes,
The dark, light in the darkness.
yes, yeah,
And the light arriving.
yeah, that's right,
And whoever wrote that was familiar with this sort of.
very much, very much. Well, and it's, I've been working on the meditation for the Blue Christmas service on Sunday, and I mean, a lot of that is talking about juxtaposition of light and dark, and so if we want this word out of, if our general Christmas celebration is light and joy and all these things, I mean, that can be a word out of place, because that's not, you sit and watch the news every night, that's probably not the first place that you go in your mind.
True.
But there's also the reality that the story of the first Christmas is not light. I mean, there is light, I mean, there's the angels appear and all this kind of stuff, but it takes place in the dark. You know, the birth is at night. And so it's just interesting to think about those ideas, and, you know, does Isaiah embody this actual word out of place? And so just to kind of make a connection with the gospel with this is, so I want to look at the Magnificat, and so that's Luke 1, 46 to 55.
Yeah.
Page 75 in the New Testament. Would somebody like to read that? Mary's Song of Praise.
My heart praises the Lord. My soul is glad because of God my Saviour, for he has remembered me, his lowly servant. From now on all people will call me happy, because of the great things the mighty God has done for me. His name is holy. From one generation to another he shows mercy to those who honour him. He has stretched out his mighty arm, has scattered the proud with all their plans. He has brought down mighty kings from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away with empty hands. He has kept the promise he made to our ancestors and has come to the help of all of his servant Israel. He has remembered to show mercy to Abraham and to all his descendants forever.
So how does that fit in with some of these things we've been reading from Isaiah? It's different images, for sure. She doesn't talk about the barren desert, and
The Magnificat seems like another one of these insertions as well.
well, yeah, could be. It certainly, whether literal or figuratively, is a word out of place, though, isn't it? I mean, you think this girl who was probably, 14 or 15 maybe, or 16, very young girl, if we went through verse by verse and looked at all these promises and prophecies that she's making, I mean, they're very dramatic. I mean, it's an entire reversal of the way of the world is what she's calling for, and what she is saying that is going to come about because of the child that she is.
But you wonder how she would know that, being so young.
It's a very mature approach, isn't it?
Yeah.
Really?
Yes,
Are
yes.
they all little quotes from the Psalms? I mean, it has footnotes here, but presumably people have taken the whole thing apart.
Well, I
Because
mean,
the language, it all seems to be familiar from
Other places.
we read other parts of, say, the Old Testament and say, oh, that's in the Magnificat. We look at it the other way.
yeah.
She would have known the writings of Isaiah, wouldn't she?
Yes,
So that she
very likely, yes.
paraphrasing that in her own way, yeah.
Yeah, could be. But
Someone-
it's-
someone so young.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's really, well, when you pair, especially this passage from Isaiah with the Magnificat, and you look at them, and even though they call for slightly different things and talk about, just things in different contexts, really, I mean, at their heart, they're the same. It's talking about just this universal reordering of the world, of everything, by the act of God.
Whatever the situation, God is there.
Yes, yeah.
I think it's in both of them.
The first footnote, which refers to the whole thing, takes you back to Hannah's
Hannah's song,
Song.
yes.
which is her sort of equivalent
Yes.
in a similar sort of, not exactly the same situation, but
Well, but she made,
when she's told that she's going to have a child in her old age, and
yes,
she dedicates him to
Yes.
the Lord.
and she makes prophecies about what that child will do
Yeah.
through God's hand.
Interesting, Isaiah isn't mentioned in the footnotes, it's Job and
Yeah.
what have you.
Well, and again, she may not necessarily be directly quoting Isaiah, but certainly, I mean, if she's familiar with this, if she were familiar with this text, you can kind of hear it echoed in what she's saying, I think. I mean, it's that same idea that, she is making a prophecy that, again, anyone who was, Elizabeth was standing there with her, but whoever, no, this was before, this is when she was visited by Gabriel.
Yeah.
But anyone who, you imagine the scene, and there's, the Annunciation, and she's told this, frankly, very difficult to believe news that she's gonna be pregnant and it's gonna be by God's Spirit, and then she utters this song of prophecy, and then you gotta imagine she goes out of the room and goes and tells her mother about it. What would okay,
Yeah.
you know?
You're gonna laugh.
Yeah. And the reason for that is, it's so much a word out of place, that how do, if we really take to heart some of these prophecies of Isaiah, if we really take to heart the text of the Magnificat, the easy response is kind of nervous laughter, right? Because,
Yeah.
wow, okay, that's,
What will your father say?
Where did that come from?
yeah,
But don't you think that when you don't recognise all these odd things that happen, because that's sort of, until you sort of almost come out of that, or something happens to make that better, or what, then you think, oh, well, actually, you connect, it's a bit like the mystery, isn't it, story,
Yeah.
You sort of then connect the other things that happened that seemed odd,
yeah,
but you don't think about those past things until the bit, as I say, like a crime drama. The things happen then, and then well, that was
you
because
kind of see it
now I
in
can see why
retrospect,
that
yeah,
happened and that happened and that happened, because to get to here sort of thing. But you don't recognise it at the time. You only recognise
Yes.
it when.
Yes,
So it's a bit like her. So this has happened, and when now she's trying to make sense of this, and then she's, oh well, actually, if you think about what I was reading, that did say, and that actually is here, and then actually, well, this is, you sort of see the,
yes,
but you don't recognise it at the time,
Yeah.
do you?
Yeah,
You
I
just
like
read
that.
it. Or,
Agatha Christie had rules about rape,
Well, that's it.
Yeah.
murder mysteries that a reader that looked at it really closely would actually be able to work it out for themselves.
yeah,
Yes.
They don't,
yeah,
you don't
No.
hide anything. There's no sudden.
yeah, yeah,
that's it.
I've just noticed actually in the Magnificat that she actually, the bit about the ancestry, that refers to what Gabriel said. He talks about he's going to be the Lord talking about the ancestors and the Lord and David's line and that.
yes, yeah. Well, and that comes back to, we talked about Isaiah and Micah, is it Micah? Yeah,
Yes,
that had
yes,
had the line about the stump or the
Yeah.
root of Jesse, yeah. So Jill, your comment made me think about something too, and I agree totally, because I think it is different for us to look back and read these, removed as we are by thousands of years from the events, and sort of interpret them and think about them and figure out how we're gonna process them individually. But I on Sunday, and I know both of you had nativity services on Sunday, but I preached on Zechariah and the story of Zechariah and his song, which actually is coming here after, it actually bookends the Magnificat, the story of Zechariah. But, so, just to recap, Zechariah is John the Baptist's father. He was a priest, a Levite. He was taking his shift at the temple, and the angel Gabriel appears to him and basically says, you and your wife are both of advanced age and have not been able to have children. You're going to have a son, and he's going to do these things. And Zechariah says, well, how is that possible? And as a result of that, what happens to Zechariah?
Becomes
Blind.
Blind.
Well, he becomes mute and deaf
Oh, sorry, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Until-
I went to mute.
until
The
the
naming
baby's
of
name.
the child.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking about, so Mary kind of says the same thing. Well, how can this be possible? Nothing happens to her. There's the story of Sarah and Abraham, and they're visited by these three strangers who tell Abraham, well, next time we come around, you're gonna have a son. And, oh, well, how is that possible? And Sarah laughs.
Sarah laughs, that's the
Yeah.
name, that's their name, isn't it?
Yeah. And nothing happens to them. Why? Why is the punishment so harsh on Zechariah? Why is he punished?
Doesn't Moses' mother have a similar
Oh,
thing? Let's have
He's older, he should have known better.
she was,
well, I think, this is me, I wonder if the point isn't that, yes, Zechariah should have known better. Because Zechariah,
was a brilliant.
he would have certainly known, Mary would have too, but he certainly would have known the story of Abraham and Sarah. He probably didn't know what was going on with Mary at the time, but, you know, I wonder if part of it is like remembering the promises and remembering the act, the work of God in the past that provides hope for the future. That in that moment, and I don't think any of us necessarily could blame him, but Zechariah, whereas the angel shows up and says, you're gonna have a child, you know, Zechariah's maybe instinct should be, that is possible, because that happened to Abraham and Sarah.
Also, if he must have known about Isaiah chapter 9 when it says what's going to happen.
Well,
But isn't
that
there,
too, yeah.
but isn't there a case sometimes something happens that's totally out of the ordinary context?
And you don't
And
associate.
the things
yeah.
go out of your head, don't they?
Yeah,
Well-
that's what I'm saying, you're only
And
thinking,
the
yeah,
knowledge
Yes.
goes.
back when
Yeah.
oh,
You think,
yeah,
hang on a minute.
So I kind of wonder if part of that story isn't in there. And if you think about it, I mean, it's not, did the nativity on Sunday, did it include Zechariah? Probably not.
No.
I mean, how many nativities have you been to that have included Zechariah? Probably not many, right? You know, he doesn't get a figure in the nativity scene, he, you know,
Aw.
I know, I know.
Joseph's sort of treated as a spare part.
Well, that's it, well, yeah, but I mean, at least Joseph's in there. We have this whole, you know, almost a whole chapter that's about the story of Zechariah that's closely linked with all this stuff with Mary and Jesus, and he kind of gets short shrift, right? So if we think about that for a minute, anyway, I think it's just a way to think about, is part of that have to do with, part of your obligation is to remember the previous works of God. There may have been a word out of place. Elizabeth being pregnant would have been a word out of place because it was something totally unexpected, viewed as unlikely or impossible. But a reminder of the power of God to work in all these different sorts of ways. So, if we then apply that to the Magnificat, if we apply that to the prophetic Old Testament texts, like the one we have from Isaiah, you know, maybe, well, I think then we have to think about, what is our nervous laughter about the Magnificat? I mean, is that a bit of an indictment on us to think about, you know, we might hear the Magnificat and think, oh, that's beautiful, oh, that'd be great, oh, that'd be lovely, but not think about it in terms of, well, God's done it before.
It's a bit of a surprise. I always thought that Magnificat came immediately after Gabriel's visit to Mary, rather than her visit to Elizabeth.
Yes,
So I obviously hadn't read it properly.
yes. Yeah, it's,
I mean, when
uh,
you see the angel with Mary, then you often get, references to the Magnificat, but there's obviously, a bit in between.
well, and I think part of that is, I mean, in general, so the nativity service is really a harmonization of a couple different versions of that story, right? Luke has all the angels and the shepherds, and Matthew doesn't have any of that.
And you always get the kings there, whereas, we know the kings probably didn't come until later,
Well-
but you get the whole lot
Yeah.
condensed down into.
And there weren't kings, and there weren't three of them, yes.
And maybe three.
But you get all that in Matthew, but Luke didn't say anything about it.
So
So,
Matthew's the one that's supposed to be all written for Jewish people.
yes, yes,
With all, it has all the Old Testament quotes in it.
yes, that's right, that's right. So anyway, but it is, there's a reason why we tell the Christmas story the way we tell it. But at the same time, because we tell it that way, then just by the nature of assimilating it in one way, you cast aside certain parts of the story. Because you hear Luke's part of this, so you don't get what's going on in Matthew at that time, and then vice versa. Does that make sense? I don't know, any thoughts about that? I think it's a challenge.
What did they feel they needed to tell them that, call the nativity story? I mean, Mark didn't bother.
John didn't bother at all.
No, well, John has this sort of poetic
Yes,
thing, and he's got presumably had the benefit of knowing some of these other texts, but,
yeah,
I mean, we wouldn't, I mean, Mark doesn't have Christmas at all, does he? I mean, but he says he's just with virgins as an adult,
yes.
and,
Yeah.
and meets his, does he actually say that John the Baptist is his cousin?
I'd have to look, I don't remember which.
I think, you know.
Well, that's more in Luke, because it's talking about the relationship between Mary
Yes,
and
yeah,
Elizabeth.
but, I mean, John the Baptist is in Mark, I don't think there's not
Yeah,
a family relationship, it's just, he's another prophet.
Yes.
You know.
yeah,
But, I mean, he makes a nice story, and presumably it was, the early writers felt that it was something that needed to be told, and presumably it matched other stories to do with
yeah.
other faiths.
Well, and I think, and we'll talk, so next week, the text we're studying for next week is from Isaiah 7. And it is, I believe, I should look at it this morning, it's the passage that talks about, depending on your translation, a virgin shall conceive. I mean, it's the big one that connects to that. And so one of the things we'll talk about next week is we'll talk about how that verse has been translated and how that translation has a huge impact on how you understand well, really the identity and nature of Jesus himself. And I don't want to get into that this week because I won't have anything to talk about next week. But you're right. I mean, we see the prophecy in the Old Testament pointing towards the events of the Gospels. But some of the things that happen in the Gospels, are they more trying to point back to the prophecy? The Gospel writers have a vested interest in making sure that the story they're telling fulfills these prophecies in the Old Testament. Not a value judgment, but just that's the point of why they're writing, is to say that these things have happened. which I think in some ways goes back to that story about Zechariah. It's a reminder, God's at work here, because a long time ago, God said this, and now it's come to pass. God's done this, said this, now it's come to pass. And so for me, that is hopeful in the sense that I think it's easy to look around and say, well, it's been 2,000 years since all this happened. Is anything gonna happen? Is anything, where's the hope, And I think that's where we have to draw hope, is from memory and experience.
And I think if you look at what's happening in the world today, and all the people who are trying to help
Yes,
in different ways.
I think the hope is that good always triumphs over evil. If you look back over history,
yeah,
there's some dreadful things have happened, but good always triumphs,
yeah,
always.
yes, yeah,
I'm reading a lot of history at the moment, and it is staggering what some of the stuff that went on, but you think, yeah, there is hope.
and if we don't remember that,
Yeah,
it is easy to slide into the hopelessness.
yeah.
So, I think there's a little bit of that going on in, not just these texts, but just in general. It's so much about, even so many of Jesus' teachings reach back into Jewish law and either redefine it or fine tune what the intent of, those things were. So, we'll remember Moses said this, I say to you this, and it's, a revision or building upon the law of Moses in that way. That gets us way off of Advent, but, I think it is, helpful to kind of think about things in that way. Any other thoughts or comments?
I think essentially, going back to the area that we were almost dismissive about, is the Emmanuel.
Yeah.
And that is what we are trying to teach children, that he was human,
Yeah,
like them,
yes, yeah,
like us. This was the example.
yeah. Well, and the Emmanuel, that's in our reading for next week.
Yeah.
So we'll, definitely talk about that some more.
You've jumped ahead again.
But I mean, we are dismissive about Mary's, the Magnificat.
Yeah,
But if we were children of the Catholic faith, we would have had this said day in, day out
yes,
throughout our lives. And yes, in the same way as we teach children the Lord's Prayer, I think it's a challenge for all parents to find out what the child is actually saying,
yes, yeah,
But this is it, and at what stage in that process do they become aware of what they're saying?
yeah.
Yeah, it's in the evening service, Anglican evening services, canticle that and the Song of Song.
Yeah.
Images, I mean, that runs again every day or every Sunday or said or sung.
Or is
As a child, you learn a lot off by heart, and it's not often until you're much older when it all falls into place and you realise what it's all about. Because you have to learn it off by heart to start with, so it's ingrained into you. So you can draw on it, can't you? I mean, it's like learning your times tables.
Yeah,
You draw on them throughout your life.
She was a teacher.
It's like us sitting
Sorry,
here
I'm an
now.
old-fashioned teacher, sorry.
Oh, they
Go on, Mike.
go ahead, Mike.
I was just thinking, it's like sitting here now. I mean, we've all lived through many Christmases, haven't we? And here we are now, and we still don't really understand it all, and we're still digging and looking, and which I think is the incredible part about it all, really.
Yeah,
And I think this will happen until our dying day, But then
Yeah.
there's hope there for that,
Yeah.
surely.
Yeah,
And the danger is as well, we take words and we listen, but we don't really take those words in.
Mm.
They're just words that are around us and we accept them or
Yeah.
not, but we just don't actually absorb them.
No.
See
Yeah.
what I mean?
So it's at the very end of this chapter that we've just been reading, it's about it's going to be happy forever and forever free of sorrow and grief. In other words, it's not going to go back. Once you're there,
Yes.
you've really arrived.
That's
Yeah.
Revelation, isn't it?
Yes, I was going to say.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's so much of that language in Revelation, I mean, you find in Isaiah and Ezekiel and, you know, some of these Old
Daniel.
Testament prophets.
Daniel.
Yeah, because, I mean, this, you know, this passage, for sure, you could almost lift out and put into the latter chapters of Revelation
Yeah.
and not even necessarily notice that it came from somewhere else. Well, lots to think about, for sure.
Hang on in there.
Yeah, that's it, that's it. I did have a song for today. Last week, we heard a rather dramatic choral anthem with orchestral accompaniment and all that sort of thing, proclaiming the vision of Isaiah and making a direct connection in that choral piece to the prophecy and, well, the lived reality through Jesus. And we'll talk more about that connection next week. But this week, a much simpler song, one voice, and I think it's piano accompanying it. It's a song called Like a Healing Stream by Bruce Harding. It's from about 20 years ago, and a lot of the imagery in it at least invokes ideas of what we talked about in our passage today or in some of the other passages that we've studied. So this is Like a Healing Stream.